Hello and welcome to the Medarots Navi review. I'm your host Lord the Loser 01, and today I invited a guest. I grabbed Kuura Isagami. If you guys don't know him, he's the YouTuber that hosts the Medarots News Network, as well as pretty active on the Medabot Discord server. This is a post intro making I'm doing here. And that was mainly because I was doing a lot of editing and I was tired when I first did this. But I squashed our 2.5 hour rant into 2 parts and cut it down to like half an hour-ish. So hope you guys enjoy. Just to start off would be, I guess we'll talk a bit about Fujioka Kenki. I've only found a few things regarding him. Like, he's the illustrator and author of the Medarots Rintaro and Medarots Navi. So that explains why
Correct.
We see Rintaro in the anime, but also in this game in particular. I didn't know he's the one that created Rintaro. I just kind of thought he was...
Not just that either. Did you know that he actually just released an art book?
Yes, I saw
fairly
that.
recently, like within the last month. And in there, he actually posts a lot of art, not just of Medarots stuff, but also of Gundam. So because he actually had a hand, I believe it was in Seed, that he did a lot of art for.
Yes, I saw that.
So it's kind of it's kind of obvious when you with this information, you look back at Navi's art, concept art, you're like, yep, I can definitely see the Gundam-esque in it.
And what I like about when it comes to just these type of illustration books in general, you can see some of the older designs, and then you just compare them to what came out. It's like, oh, that's where, yeah, you can definitely see where the inspiration for certain Medabots, but also, like, if you compare it to the Gundam scene, it's like, oh, okay, so this is where all that extra work came from.
Yep. Let me see. According to this as well, he also was in charge of Mobile Suit, MS Igloo, both Apocalypse and Hidden 1 Year War. He was also in charge of Seed, Seed Destiny, and Seed Destiny Special Edition as mecha design. And even a lot of his newer designs like Kreut Bison and Gothic Mate very easily show his dedication and his work.
Oh, yeah. Like, if you compare it to his earlier designs to now, it's like he puts a lot of details into the little crevices. Like,
Gothic Mate is one of his children, yes. This was at the 3.5-year anniversary when he released Gothic Mate, which was an instant hit. Medarots' name was Cassia for the story.
Okay. Well, I guess to start her off, we'll talk about the game's premise, that being the plot. So, plot-wise, I cannot find a good explanation other than we're a school student that apparently discovered an alien Medabot, which I just refer to as the alien seed.
I mean, you're not wrong technically, but yeah, you basically are on the right track. That is essentially the whole premise. You as the player, as Kazumi, you kind of find out that he's been at the academy he attends. He kind of knows his stuff, but a couple of his other classmates aren't necessarily pleased that he's kind of showing them up. So they pull pranks on him all the way around the school until it eventually comes up to the point they actually end up stealing his partner's medal, so he can't row battle anymore. So then that's when I want to say he was essentially dared to go check out the abandoned schoolhouse where he accidentally finds the alien seed, like you mentioned, Mistral, which actually makes news because no one had actually seen it before or heard about it. And that's essentially what drives Kazumi and his class to fly up to this cluster space station, where they actually do a lot of specialized row battle research in different kinds of biomes and terrains as like an advanced research laboratory kind of thing, kind of like a field trip.
Yeah. Okay.
And then, of course, what goes awry is when the station becomes detached and you have to climb your way to the top to try to find a way to contact base and tell them where you are so they can come rescue you.
Yeah, I kind of figured that this entire satellite was for research because, like, interesting choices of what they put on the space station is like, you have what looks like a possible active volcano, you got an avalanche site, which looks like for snow, or skiing purposes.
Exactly. Yeah, and I like to say, like I said, I want to say that's probably just so they could simulate different biomes up there, kind of like how in a lot of very big sci-fi, how like have research rooms for different biomes or different fields. So you'll have one that's like a really empty plain, one that's a really rocky territory, because they want to properly test and experiment how things behave on different grounds and different environments. So greenhouses are the same way too. You have to make specialized biomes to treat certain kinds of plants or whatever your research subject is. I want to say that was likely the same premise for the cluster station is they would have a private area that they could control so that they can properly field test and experiment with things without having any outside interruptions possibly damage their research.
Yeah, and you can definitely see that by the fact that each room is closed. Like each room is separate, nothing's connected except just a walkway, but every room is, if this were to be animated and put in a show, you'd see that the doors would close and then everything would kind of light up. And it's like, okay, this is
Correct.
welcome to this biodome or welcome to the residential
Correct.
area.
It kind of like an airlock or something to make sure that they keep each one separate.
Yeah. So what was the goal of the space robos, if you know it?
That I actually don't know. Like I said, I've not played Navi for quite some time, and a lot of the information I picked up on was essentially, like in hindsight, especially as I started playing Medarots S years later. Um, I want to say, based on what I understand, by the way, and if any of my Japanese followers or any mutual followers find this, we would absolutely love the feedback and the clarification. I want to say that the entire premise of the space robos was kind of for the same instance as why we found Mistral to begin with and why they wanted to put him up on the space station, kind of keep him contained. So very likely this whole it's super powerful, we can take over the world with it kind of thing, especially as you climb the cluster station and find out that Kazanbai, closer to the end, is actually the head of them, and you have to face him off before you face off against Mistral.
I kind of assumed they were after Mistral, but half the time when I kept going back to the main area, I was like, oh no, it's still here. So I just kept wondering back, like, maybe they're just after some kind of research or maybe...
That's a very plausible point too, is, again, because it is a research station, there probably is a lot of very interesting things up there that are not revealed. For instance, beta features for new Medarots that are being worked on, or new models in general, as depicted by Kaiser Beetle or Luminous Stag, which are like the advanced beta models that they were putting together. The Row Battle research modules for other models such as Pegasus Rider or Noel as other examples. So very likely that might be a good idea as well.
But again, because this is Metabots, we're talking about the rubber robos or space robos, it's kind of hard to pin down what their actual motive is. Like it could be...
That's very true.
Like you kind of assume it's world domination, but sometimes it could be like, no, we're here for vacation actually. So you don't actually know.
Yeah, there's no real telling with them because it just kind of flips about by the day. One day they're entirely harmless. Next day you want to make sure they don't leave their house.
Yeah, I am confused about when after you beat the space robo's boss, it's like we crashed into a meteor and then we just head out, and it's like I couldn't quite tell. It's like, was this like the base of the alien Metabots, or was this the base of the space robos? That was the one thing I couldn't wrap my head around. Because there were living areas on the meteor, so it's like, I just assumed it was the space robo hideouts.
I'm not 100% sure on that one, honestly, but I want to say it probably ties into the kind of to the major ending, post-game ending that I mentioned earlier, where say with Zero Suicide as example as the penultimate final boss, and essentially how you fought him was kind of like a 5-round marathon, where Navi Kamu joined you and you fought against the four fossils, which were Mono Cruciana, Dityranno, Tripatera, and Corabrachio. And then when you conquered all 4 of those, then you got to fight Zero Suicide, which was kind of like the combined form of all of them. And he was particularly aggressive for that same reason. But one of the other really big things to mention, though, functionally, was each of the 4 of those celestial fossils was unique in the sense that they all had a mastery and a transform skill, but each one was a different type. Cruziana, for instance, specialized in status or interruption-based skills and would only morph his parts into that. Tyranno was only offense and attack-based parts. Patera was all defense or defense-oriented, and Brachio was all healing. But then when they all come together and form one, they become one very aggressive penultimate boss. That's followed by a set of, if I recall correctly, it was Pupa Beetle or Pupa Stag, I think, relative to version, which are basically just floating balls of energy.
So moving on, I guess we'll talk about the features, which I guess it would be the gameplay here. This is a 5x5 battle rather than our usual 3x3, and it's on a
Right.
what most people are kind of describing as, I guess, a Fire Emblem-like battle style. Like
Yep.
you have your board.
Kind of like Fire Emblem. I've seen a lot of people describe it like Advance Wars as well.
Yes.
And the entire premise to that, which I honestly really liked both when I first played it and even as I look back on it, is compared to the original games where they followed what they called shuffle run, which is run to the center line, do your turn, run back, and you keep going until the enemy leader dies or until you run out of time. With this very unique style, it added another level of play that at the time was not attempted by Medarot, but with a little bit of fleshing it out could have been a truly fantastic title. Instead of basing on speed, which a lot of the titles prior to it relied on in terms of mobility, this one did have a speed factor relative to legs and terrain, but every time you had your turn, you were given a certain amount of AP or action points, and you were free to spend those action points however you please. You could move, you could attack, you could do both, or you could even just plant your butt there and stay still if you wanted to spend a turn and charge Metaforce.
Let's see. Another feature, and I don't know whether or not this was the first time they did it, but in this game, you didn't actually have to fully charge the Metaforce meter to actually use the Metaforce. So like you had 150, but you didn't actually have to fully charge it, but you did need like 25 AP to use it.
Correct. It had a minimum charge requirement, and if you unlocked it, your metal was raised enough for it, you were able to kind of launch it early, I guess you could call it, because you had that amount of charge, which kind of ties back into the whole AP system thing, where if you chose not to do anything, then you could just use all your points and charge Metaforce, which was also really important because even though meta change was first introduced in Medarot 3 a couple of years prior, meta change was also a very core feature to a lot of the new models of Medarots Navi, almost to the point that like a good chunk of its roster had the ability to transform one way or another, which was great. And in terms of features, it is worth mentioning for this that they had a very unique mechanic on how their meta changers behaved, and they were sorted into two categories. You either had power change or you had shift change. Shift changes could transform back and forth every turn as they please because they did not require any AP or Metaforce charge to actually use it. Whereas power change required you to actually have a small amount of charge in your gauge or spend a turn charging it before you could actually transform. Now, once you were transformed, then you could go ham, but you needed that initial energy in your gauge in order to do so. Popular examples of this include Kaiser Beetle and Luminous Stag, who are the well-known power changers, aside from a good handful of others that you'd meet in post-game.
Definitely, and you kind of see why the developers wanted the power changes to be that way. Like, you had to spend one turn before you changed.
Correct, and hope and pray that you didn't get nuked before that happened.
Let's see. Another feature, what I call the Build-A-Bot stations. I didn't mind that. It did save on having to like fight the same opponent 4 times, and in those areas you had very unique Metabots that you didn't need to fight. However, there were some moments where it brought confusion, where progress just stopped, even though I had fought like 2 or 3 times. I was like, no, you're still at 40%. It's like, what the heck? We would like you to expand the plot. I was like, I hate you guys.
Yep, and I think a lot of that probably would have come from the fact that, as English speakers playing a Japanese game, it's just something that gets lost in the language barrier, which we kind of have to fight with. But I really did like the Row Battle research modules as well. Took a little while for me to kind of learn what they were when I first played Navi, but then when I understood, it was like fantastic. because essentially how those behaved is once you first controlled them, you kicked the space robos out and you took control of the module. What you were allowed to do, and you were able to do this in actually any module, not just the research modules, but in any module, is any particular party members that you did not use often or did not really care to use, you could deploy them there to guard the module so that it couldn't be taken back over again.
In theory.
In theory, and how well they were able to protect the module was relative. I want to say it was to how many people that you deployed to protect it. So naturally, if you only stuck one person there, they would not be doing a very good job. I want to say it also had a hand in who particular it was and what terrain that particular biome was. So if you had a sea base party member go into an aquatic base, then they'd be really good at it. Anyone else maybe not as much. And I had a lot of different factors that kind of ranked into that, which was honestly really good as I look back on it as well. But with these research modules specifically, if you were able to protect them a certain number of cycles, I guess I can call them for lack of a better term, they rewarded you with the full set of a very specialized Medarot. Pegasus Rider and Noel are very good examples, or even upgraded versions of the main party members, which would be Bug Shield, Scythe Cutter, and Blazer Multi, that were not only earnable through these research modules, but theoretically you could also indefinitely farm them before you reach the post-game, as long as you were able to just keep protecting that module over and over after you get the reward.
And the last feature I want to talk about was movement manipulation. So we had Medabots that, what I call created a status effect, so that just made you move diagonally only. You had the magnets, where you couldn't move closer to a certain Medabot who used that magnet.
Crowd control.
Yeah. And then you had Island Croco, who could just pull everyone towards him. So I was like,
yep.
Like, those were cool features, and I don't think we'll ever see something like that again in the newer games. I don't know how... Is Island Croco in Unlimited Nova? How does he work?
Not yet. Okay. And the whole movement thing you mentioned was it's actually a very, very good point, because especially on the 5x5 grid like that, it was a very big core mechanic, because each different kind of attack had different ranges to like how far that they were able to hit things, or how close that certain enemies had to be in order to make contact. So having someone like Island Croco just constantly drag his allies across the field, it was kind of a double-edged sword, but also in a very hilarious way. Because on one hand, it made it immensely difficult for you to be able to land proper hits on who you were trying to target, because they were being constantly pulled every direction possible. But at the same time, I'm only imagining that from the enemy perspective, where, okay, you have one person here ready to attack, he is in sights and in range, ready to go, and suddenly, oops, you're now 3 spaces forward to the left, and now he's completely out of range because Croco decided he got homesick and wanted everybody near him. So it was a very unique mechanic, and it's actually good you brought that up, because there's actually 2 other moves that were first introduced in Navi that were later brought back in Unlimited Nova, called they were initially called Blow Away and Suction, which were also designed for crowd control.
Yes, I know those moves very well.
Yes, and in those games, it didn't necessarily have the weight, pun intended, I guess, if you want to take it that direction, in how powerfully that kind of crowd control could be. I mean, yeah, sure, you could kind of manipulate an enemy's movement if you're able to push or pull them certain ways. It just didn't quite have the weight, whereas in Unlimited Nova, where they used the shuffle run, where it had much more weight to it, where a very poorly timed blow away would accelerate an enemy's cooldown phase, or poorly timed suction would accelerate the enemy's heat phase. It takes a little bit more juggling in the more recent titles, but that kind of adds more to the weight of how powerful those attacks can be when mastered.
Yeah, definitely in Navi with the blow away or suction, you didn't feel too punished. It was like, oh, it's just a minor inconvenience. But in the
maybe one space, yeah, if you got a really painful hit, but otherwise you hardly moved at all when they used it.
Yeah, most of the times I found like, oh, I didn't actually move. I just see the animation. It's like, did something happen here? I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, you just saw them kind of shiver there, like they tried moving and they failed at it. So we're like, okay, and I took maybe 10 points of damage. What else is there to it? Okay, nothing. I guess I'll move on then.
All right. So moving on from the features, I guess we'll talk about the pros here. So starting with the plot, mine is very short and it's like it was comedic. I can just tell from interactions, even though I couldn't read Japanese. I knew there was a lot of fun gags going on, just some hilarious scenarios. But I think they appeared more so in the post game rather than in the main plot. That you got those gags and hilarities.
Definitely. And one thing to mention about the plot as well, I didn't think of it initially, but that you did remind me of a really great point, is the entire reason how Kasumi kind of became the entire main character of Navi was after the cluster module was detached and started floating freely in space, all the students started freaking out, going, "What are we gonna do? Who are we gonna look at?" And they all look at the class president, who's like, "Well, obviously you're in charge. You're the class president that's supposed to oversee all of us." And he's like, "Well, not anymore." Hands his sash down. "Kazumi, you're the class president. Bye," and just leaves.
Is that the guy who
It's like,
locked
well, I
us?
guess
Who locked us in the shed before takeoff?
yeah. He's like, "What?"
Okay.
Yep, exactly. So it's like, well, I guess I'm in charge now. Better go round up all the other students. I'm to start climbing the module one at a time. So yeah, that's definitely a very unique point there, where it's not necessarily as serious, and it does have its moments where it's like, well, you're leader now. Have fun. I'm gonna go cry in a corner and panic because we're lost in space.
I mean, to be fair, I think that's a pretty accurate depiction. Because like how many scenarios are you gonna get lost in space? It's like, okay, I know
I
exactly what
mean,
to do.
it is kind of a justified reaction. I have to give the benefit of the doubt. If we were all suddenly trapped on a space station that detached from the main module and we just started floating freely in orbit, I think my first reaction would be, great. Now what? Who's in charge? Am I? Not anymore.
Move on to the next point, the game mechanics. As we've discussed earlier, very bold move to change the battle style for this game.
Yes, it was definitely a very unique choice, but I think one that ended up paying off in the long run. Um, for the reasons that we did mention previous, it did have a lot of very unique and new play styles that made a lot of different play styles not quite feasible before now suddenly central to winning. And they also used it to add new mechanics like blow away, suction, and crowd control to kind of help really spice up the game mechanics and overall encouragement of moving around the field instead of sitting in one spot.
Yeah. Moving on to the visuals. Character portraits, I think they were pretty good. Um, Again, it's an unfair comparison because outside of Japan, we got the remake of the core games, and that got a lot of love into it. So it's kind of a unfair comparison right there.
Right, and it's also kind of it's also kind of not unfair to grade it harshly for that reason, because you're only able to do so much with 16-bit. And one of the other really big reasons that Navi even existed was because they wanted to really showcase the kind of power behind the Game Boy Advance engine that was released at that time, whereas the first 5 games were still on the original Game Boy or Game Boy Color. So a lot more colors, a lot more color diversity, stronger engine meant they could do a whole lot more with it, different mechanics, different play styles that were not originally available or even possible on the original Game Boy.
Yeah, so this was Navi was basically the first GBA game that they tried to. Okay.
It was the first real project aside from 2 Core, which is basically just a rehash of Medarot 2 with newer graphics and everything.
Yeah.
That they really were putting the GBA engine to its limits. One other interesting fact I want to mention as well on Navi that was mentioned by a dear buddy of mine who lives in Japan, and this was in light of the 7 Lucky Gods that were released in Medarot S as kind of like I'm not going to call them hidden bosses, but like very powerful aura emitting boss types, I guess I can call them, that were designed by Horama Rin himself. According to what my friend told me, that Horomarin, had actually been cooking up those particular 7 designs for years, almost 20 years. And if he had it his way, we would actually have not gotten Medarots Navi at all. And he would have had a completely new game take place starring those 7 lucky gods that he designed, and we would not have gotten this fantastic title, but maybe even something different.
Again, I'm going to jump the gun here just because it has to be said. I only have one main complaint about the visual.
Oh, do tell.
Whose idea was it to make Navi's meta change form have those weird long legs?
Oh, with Navico.
Yes, I really have to question whose idea was this?
I really can't say. I can tell you that when Navikamu returned in later games such as 8 and 9, she did retain the humanoid form, but her kit was basically maintained almost one to one as to what it was in Navi, where she specialized in a skill called Power Link, which is even right now currently exclusive to her, where she would share a percentage of her heat, cool, or power with a particular ally to make them go faster or hit harder by supporting them.
Moving on to the music. Apparently there are only like 2 battle soundtracks. I didn't even know there was a second, but I will say the boss music, that was not the final boss, but the secondary boss
The boss theme in general.
Yeah, that was a great soundtrack.
Navi's soundtrack, there actually were 3 battle themes. You just never really got to play around with them unless you knew where you were going in the settings. But yeah, Navi's music, I have really nothing negative to say on it, and so I probably will not even comment on that one for dislike, because all the tracks, the overworld, the menus, it was just an absolute banger. And in fact, it wasn't until they released the official soundtracks with the Classics and Classics Plus collections, and especially when they brought the tunes back in Unlimited Nova and remastered them, which are absolute bangers, by the way, highly recommend, that they actually gave them names. The first one, which plays when you first start playing the game, is Fog Alert. Then you also have Over Rough Waves, and then the most famous of them all is Days of Typhoon. And then the boss theme in particular is called Galaxy Combat. So absolute bangers of themes. Like they are well known across the Medarots community for being very well known fan favorites in one term or another.
One of the ironic parts I'm finding right now is, even though most of us say like, this is a okay game, is not something we might go back to, we're pulling out a lot of great things that just carried forward. I just want to point that out.
I mean, it's kind of like the sense like it was with Sonic 06. I mean, the game absolutely sucked, but its soundtrack was a total banger. But that is not the case, of course, with Navi, because it was a very well-received game. Well, overall well-received game, but its soundtrack absolutely was there, 100%. Visual, music, mechanics. It was definitely a very well-made game all around. Just a couple minor bugs and a very, very daring attempt at something new.
Moving on, the areas or locations, we kind of mentioned them, but I liked how the theme, as we talked about, it was for research purposes, and again, that was made the most apparent when you were on like a mountain or a volcano, because you just look at this and it's like, there's no way someone would do this just for the hell of it. This has got to be for research purpose, that you put a volcano in your station.
Exactly, and the fact that they had all these different types and biomes, and I mean, they even had like 3 different kinds of open plain or grassy fields, which was again for research purpose. But it made for a very dynamically and very aesthetically pleasing game, because there would be some areas where you really didn't like or care for, but then there'd be others that were just an absolute vibe, like very soft fields, the there's like 2 different city or townscapes. There's the candy house in the forest, which is kind of there for reasons. You had like ancient dungeons or temples. you had sand pits, volcanoes, as you mentioned, mountains, very dynamic areas overall. So it definitely did not leave you bored.
Yeah, Mechanic House 1, I think that was just a nod to Western culture. Because if you also go to the lake and talk to it in the right angle, you get the sword Medabots, whose name I do not know.
I want to say it was probably Noel, if I recall correctly. The green and gold one?
Yes.
Yeah, Noel. Very well loved Valkyrie type.
Moving on to characters. All the designs were very unique for each one. I will say, even though this is jumping to the cons, post game, it doesn't look like as much love went into the art style for the post game portraits.
Yeah, I can definitely see it. Now, to kind of play devil's advocate to your answer, though, you do have to remember that with it being 16-bit, you were only able to do so much. So with sprite mugshots like that, you're only limited to a certain grid, and you only had that grid to make as many details prominent as you could. So as a result, there were a lot of details that probably had to be omitted, or they probably just didn't look as aesthetically pleasing as before because you just don't have as high as a color palette or as of a mugshot size as you're allowed to.
True. If I could read Japanese, there'd probably be two or three characters that I would like for their personality. I don't know who they'd be, but I'm pretty sure I'd
Yes.
find at least a few of them. It's like I gotta always use this guy just for the heck of it.
And it honestly was very dynamically diverse overall too, which I really liked. Kind of tying back to what we said about areas, because you had all these different biomes in terms of where you could go or what kind of research you want to conduct. But as Kazumi traveled across, up the cluster and brought the class back together, you met all these very unique individuals that all shared some kind of theme. And they were all actually different clubs of the school that you had to face against. For instance, the sports team, the aquatics team, the weirdos they called them, which were kind of like your otaku weeb kind of characters. You have your pretty boys, you have your idols, and then you had a pair of them that were actually the exchange students that used Passionate, the flamingo type, and Vulture, the vulture type. So it had a very diverse cast just for the classmates alone. But then you also have the space robos, you have the main characters as well. And then, of course, you did also have the tie-in in the post-game with a lot of the older characters from Medarots 3 and R, such as Phantom Retort, the Screws, Ikki and Arika, Rintaro, and some of Rintaro's classmates and teacher.